Okay, hi. Welcome to our equinox celebration. Uh, so we celebrate the equinox because we are celebrating and acknowledging the rotation of the Earth around the sun, a divine connection to our home planet, the Earth. Right now, we are about to enter the equinox, which means there's around the world, there's equal parts light and darkness, 12 hours of one, 12 hours of the other. So at this time, we are going to talk about balance and how the world and society has been in balance and out of balance and its fluctuation back and forth. And so the title of the story is Why the World is the Way It Is. So as a telling of history, and history has, when you decide to tell a history, you have to decide what pieces to pull in. So we can, there's all sorts of facts. So how you shape your understanding of history is a filter of the information that you find relevant. For this talk, I'm going to talk about two things. The underlying worldview humanity's had. So a worldview is made up of the things we assume just the way they are, that is the way they are. It's made up of ideas about how the world works and how we relate to each other, and it forms kind of the basis assumptions that a group has. Now that's changed, even though we don't usually examine the worldview we have, it does change over time. So I'm going to talk about the changes in worldview over time, and particularly in Western worldview, because I love the whole planet. Why just the Western worldview? Because right now that Western worldview is really dominant on the planet. If you look at a collection of, say, the top 20 world leaders, biggest countries, economies in the world, they will almost all be wearing suits, Western-style suits. Their very dress is informed by a Western worldview, or at least parts of it. The second thing I want to talk about is the influx of technology. So technology shapes the way we relate to the world, and technology also shapes the way we see the world. And so that seeing directly affects how the worldview. So those two, the worldview, the philosophy, the understanding of the worldview, and technology have this back and forth relationship of influencing how the world is at any moment. Yeah. As we go along this talk, I will critique and talk about the different worldviews. And sometimes when that's farther away, it's easy. Oh yeah, they're old ideas. We know, we kind of see the holes in it. But as we get closer to current day, these get to ideas that we may hold ourselves, that we might be, not want to question or have a hard time when something's critiqued that's closer to us. So I'd ask that as we get closer to today's time period, if there's something you're just like, well, I'm not sure about that, it's okay. Questioning is good. And also just holding space so to hear the message as a whole and how it interrelates with one another. That is a way we make effect change and get clarity with ourselves. Okay. So let's begin the story of why the world is the way it is. I'm going to start with a little monk from Italy who became known as Saint Francis of Assisi. In the late 1100s, Saint Francis lived at a time in Italy when the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, was dominant, and the underlying worldview was one of spiritualism and asceticism. That is the view that the things that are spiritual are most important. The unseen world is the most important thing. And this world that we have, this material world, should be kind of disregarded. It's not super important. And so people would give their wealth, their substance to the religious source. So the Catholic Church was very, very wealthy, very powerful, and it got in conflict with more the magistrates, the governments of the time. But into this really spiritualist, aesthetic worldview came St. Francis of Assisi, and he had deep mystical experience. He did not teach very doctrine. He just had this experience where he began to fully experience everything as sacred. The plants, the trees, this was divine, everything. Yes, the other world, the spiritual world was real, but the dog and the beggars and people especially. And so he, using the asceticism, using the self-denial of the time, the spiritualism, he reduced himself to poverty from being very rich. He reduced his clothes to nakedness. He wore a beggar's rag his whole life. He would often go without shoes. He would eat things that were not good, like begging food. Even if he had a regular food available, he'd often just prefer beggar's food. But his presence was such that people around him escaped the spiritualism of the day and found light in him, because he said there is divinity in everything. So he'd preach to animals and things. And so he, by force of personality, gained a great following, which he did not particularly like. I mean, he kind of dealt with it because more and more people were flocking to him as a saint, as someone who saw through divinity through the world, into the world. They saw through him divinity in all things, and that was so attractive. And so what happened was the change in culture, that along after his death, after his for the next few years, there was an influx of Arabic numerals and accounting from the Arabic world, which was really the center of civilization at that point. Some farming techniques from Islam, from the Muslim world, and it caused that with his seeing divine everything caused a renaissance. There was a little Renaissance beforehand, and then there was a main Italian Renaissance. And if you go and look at the artwork of the time, especially, you can see how the people there were so invested. They had lived in a worldview in which they were looking for the divine in the material world, and it produced. And I was able to have the privilege of going to Florence, Italy, and the whole place is just one piece of art. Like everything, every little thing is put with purpose and intention and is beautiful. And so that was a humongous change. And what was coming out of that was a worldview that went from asceticism and spiritualism to something called mind-body dualism. That is that, yes, the spirit, the mind is sacred. The spirit world is real and sacred, but also there's sacred in the body. We now respect the body. We respect it, and we see the divine in all things. Because of this, because of that Renaissance, they were looking for the divine in the material world. We get a process. They started to create a system of investigation of how to find God's will and how things operate. And we now call that the scientific method, or science. See, at the time, there was no division between science and religion. It was the seeking of the divine in the material, and they did. And they were able to learn so much about the world and how it operated, and began to change things, and it began to change the relationship to the material world. And so out of this change, the underlying worldview started to change again into something called humanism. Now, humanism was a revision of this culture, and it was partially a response to the dominant church culture at the time, the Christian culture. So this humanism said that the physical is sacred, not just the spiritual. We just talked about that. That there is compatible truth. All truth is compatible. Truth, no matter where it is valuable and good. And each person had a dignity. There was dignity in each person. And that humans needed to rebuild a lost spiritual center and wisdom. And in doing so, they rediscovered the Greek writings and philosophy and merged that with their spiritual sensibilities of Christianity. And I resonate with this because I feels like that we are in a different but similar kind of place where we can rediscover the spirit of humanity. But we'll come back to that. So as the science progressed, as this new wave of seeing the divinity in the sacred and everyday things, and humans having innate dignity, and investigation into the real world, some things happened. Some science grew, and some things that happened, some major changes happened. Was one, they created better seafaring technology, ships, navigation, those types of things. But what this did was it brought those ideas from Europe, and where they were to cross the seas, to go around continents and be explored. And so the exchange of, at first, goods broadened, and their cultural exchanges with other places broadened. And then in the 1500s, a technology occurred in Europe that first started in China. The Arabs had it for a while and didn't do much with it. It was the movable type printing press. And the person that got a hold of that thing and used it so well was Martin Luther. Now, there were many Protestant Reformation people before him, but he got a hold of printing press and started the first media war. He printed thousands of pamphlets. He wrote nonstop. His ideas spread everywhere. And for the first time, because of printing press, a repeatable printing press, ideas, information spread in a way that it had not before, and changed. It created a division. It made a change in the religious makeup of Europe. So we had the Catholic Universal Church, and then Protestant. They protested and started a different religious organizations and different beliefs, and it was hard-fought freedom, hard-won freedom at the cost of many lives, but it did happen. And this changed how people saw the world. One, seafaring got us in proximity to other cultures and other goods, and so we kind of started to see how the world, it was bigger. Where we thought the world was got bigger, and information started to move faster too. So manuscripts from other places started to arrive faster. Information from other places, news, stories, scientific development was going and spreading. And so it was an expansion of not just people moving, but of information. Now, in this period, a lot of ideas spread. And as people got to travel more, the humanism transformed into, and humanism, along with the technology, transformed the underlying worldview a little bit. It altered it in important ways to what we call the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment took as its core this idea that human reason was a path to human success, to human happiness. That if we could just learn to apply human reason, then humanity would flourish. And this had a couple core components. One, there was a skepticism. It was okay to question things. So we've moved from humanism that was, there's enlightenment and we should learn about things. So, okay, it's generally good to explore things through skepticism as opposed to just having faith that the church fathers knew everything. That people would have a social contract in contrast to authoritarianism of either church or state, that people had a contract, a relationship that we needed to adhere to. We started strong individualism. That is that instead of having being part of a collective, that our main source of self was a collective self and group, that each person had to come into a relationship with themselves. They call that, in Protestantism, it was God in the Bible. Each person had to realize this for themselves. And that the highest use of intellect was rationalism, as opposed to just faith in God and not questioning, but we were really supposed to achieve our highest good we needed to use our mind in a rational way and really learn things and to be able to think through the relationship of things. And lastly, the spiritualism of the former day with St. Francis turned to deism. That is, there is a God being, but everything is holy. And so the sacred was seen in everything. And so the reason why this is so important is because this worldview, this Enlightenment worldview, traveled with colonialism and was the basis of the United States Constitution and constitutional governments in general. So the things I just described, we talk about, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are Enlightenment worldview aspects, pieces. So there are two main stories that went with this. One is sacred sovereignty. This was that each individual is the supreme power and authority over themselves. And so any government had to only had legitimate power if the people, the sovereignty people, agreed to that government. And so, and collectively governed. And so democracy is, or at least representative democracy, as we have, became believed to be, say, divinely inspired, the way natural world order should be, because it is because it aligned with the underlying worldview. The second part is a story of progress. You see, as they were getting more and more technologically advanced, they understood more about the world, there became this idea that our progress as human, the problems of humanity, will be solved by investigation of the natural world. And not only just investigation, but domination. Our control of the natural world is tied to our human flourishing. Now, this is hard to argue with because in those years, we are all greatly benefited by the science. Like, I love flush toilets. I love clean water. I like that we can use electricity. I like that I can travel. I can travel through the air in these amazing things called airplanes. Like, I get it. I understand this. It's a compelling story. But we'll see that both these stories have their blind spots and their limitations. In this, as we go on, as Enlightenment became the major dominant story, something else, a technology that came that was so disruptive. Oh my goodness, it changed everything. It's hard for us to even comprehend a time before this technological change. It is called the Industrial Revolution. Now think of this for a moment. Before the Industrial Revolution, what was possible, what humans could do, was limited by our own muscle and energy and by animal muscle energy. We could get animals to get us around, to plow our fields. We could harness them. We had to use our own strength to build things, but that was a limit. That was we could use to do work. We really had muscle power. In the Industrial Revolution, we harnessed natural forces. We harnessed the power of water and steam. We then harnessed the power of this magical thing called electricity and learned to capture the lightning itself. And also we started to get energy straight out of the ground, the very elements of the earth. We started to realize that there was energy captured in the earth, and we started mining oil, fossil fuels for fuel that had so much energy in it. And so we became masters of the natural world and started to extract all this energy to be able to do things. And it's miraculous. In doing so, it completely disrupted our lives. We went from a world in which most people had to be agriculture or home product. Like we had factories, but they were human-powered factories, and most people had to produce food. Instead, in the Industrial Revolution, we started to collect into cities, by factories where we produce things. We became dependent on the energy and on the machines. And we started to reorder how we worked, how our lives were, how our families worked, how everything worked around machines and the power we extracted, because you couldn't compete in the world if you didn't. This is one of the major shifts, was any place that didn't adopt industrial capacities became subject to those with industrial capacities. So there wasn't really a choice. Not for any major world power anyways, not for most people. And so we remade society in service of machines. The second part of that is that at the same time, and this goes directly everywhere that industrialization took place and the societal change happened, we see a dramatic increase in population. Now we can debate on what those things were or why exactly it was, but we just see demographically, wherever we put in factories and roads and industrialization, population just explodes. We've reordered society, we've reordered relationships, how we engage in the world, and so we seem to have made lots of babies. In that scientific development, we also started to get better. At first, industrialization was terrible. People died a lot. But very quickly, we figured out how to keep people alive, how to increase food production, how to increase safety. And so child mortality plummeted, which is great. Wonderful. We just have lots more people. The effect of both of these is that our relationship to nature changed, where we saw the sacred in everything. The worldview started to change towards materialism, towards the thing that we're controlling. The cars and the factories weren't seen as sacred, part of God's order anymore. They were machines. And so our relationship to and our production was done by machines, and so our interaction with the natural world became less skewed, changed. We became less interaction with natural processes, and more we were removed from the naturally occurring processes of the world and change to more structured machine-like structures, both society and actual surroundings. Now, with all this disruption, you'd think somebody was like, oh no, we got a problem. Well, you're exactly right. There are people that pointed out that there was a huge problem going on. And we're trying to deal with it. Some major thinkers in this area were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. You may know these words, these names. They saw this change in industrialization and had some thoughts and some warnings and some ideas. And so they proposed some predictions. They predicted that monopolies, that people would try to monopolize all of that power because industrialization allowed people to own the way things were produced. And that was more or less true. That people would be exploited. So in service of producing more stuff and servicing machines, that people, the workers, would be made dehumanized. That we would regard output and machines value higher than the lives of the people, and that also we could see happen. Now, they did talk about globalization as a race to the bottom. This didn't happen exactly as they thought, because yes, globalization does cause exploitation of workers. We can see that today. However, for a lot of places, we realized that if your people that are buying your materials are poor, they can't afford your products. And so Henry Ford did this. He started paying his workers more, enough so they could at least buy the products they were making. And so we have this industrialization that has to, yes, produce more things, but also if it's kept in if it's working in a way which benefits both the production and the workers, then workers should be able to afford and live according and be able to get by the things that the thing's producing. That's where we get some balance off. That's the tension there that we have. So they predicted that well. And they had this one saying that I'm trying to get it right. It says they saw the subservience and human sophistication to unnatural and imaginary appetites. That is, they saw that we'd run out of things to sell people, and we would make up stuff that was totally unnatural and kind of imaginary appetites. And we have done that. Oh my goodness, we have done that all over the place. So that is a fair assessment. However, there were some major flaws in what they talked about, and this is where people who really don't like Marx are correct, totally, absolutely correct. They framed a worldview in which the workers were oppressed and the owners of production were the oppressors. And they created a worldview of oppressor and oppressed. It's a major flaw, because in that world of oppressor and oppressed, there's only two sides to it. You either are oppressed or you're an oppressor. And if we look at history and we follow it even a little bit, we can see that whenever an oppressed class gets the skills and does the things to overthrow the oppressor, those exact worldviews and skills produce a more effective oppressor class. They've simply flipped sides. And so what you get over time is that everyone feels oppressed. Because just to be a good person, you're like, I live in this worldview. You may not have chosen it, but you were given it, where there's oppressor and oppressed, and I'm on the right side, so therefore I am the oppressed. So even the people who are in power feel oppressed and have the money and power, feel the pressure of oppression. Like they feel like they're oppressed. And they may not be wrong entirely, because people do hate them, but it's a system. So this is a system that goes nowhere. It just fuels hatred and violence. Okay, so as we move on, industrialization has taken over. It's reshaped the landscape. It literally reshaped society. It's reshaped our relationship to the natural world. And so we come in the early 1900s to something called modernism. And modernism is the effect, like the evolution of the Enlightenment period with all of that industrial technology. It's reshaped how things work. The first thing we'll notice is that as we started to control the natural world more, we started to see more, relate to the world more and more, not as a process, a divine thing, but as the only thing that's real. Materialism is the underlying worldview, a part of the worldview, that where the only thing that's real is material. And even like all of religion was then filtered through this idea that that only things that we can see and touch are real and sense, and everything else is not real. So then God became this thing that I have not seen yet. That God exists in a place that is not here. We don't know where it is, but anywhere where this materialism took hold, the very idea of spirituality changed. And so the underlying worldview shifted under our feet. It produced this idea that there's two ideas. One is called empiricism. That is the only justifiable knowledge can be had by our experience. So think of materialism. So only things I can see, hear, touch are real. And that's the only way we can know things is by our experiences through our senses. But remember, it's in an underlying materialist worldview. So only things are material. And so even if we look at scientific, we can look smaller with microscopes and find smaller and smaller things. Those are the only things that are real. And then along with that, there was rationalism that said, that's great. But there's a level of knowledge of things that are real that can only be had by mental perception. So let me get this. This is called rationalism. That is to say, if say a triangle, we can make a thing that's a triangle, and we can say that's real because we experience it. But if you look at it, that's never going to be perfect. The only perfect triangle that could ever be produced is what we know in our head. So the thing in our head is more real because it's perfect and it's descriptive of a thing that is realer than the triangle we just made. So rationalism said there's a level of knowledge that, or a class of knowledge that sits beyond just perception. It's in the imagination. These kind of contradict each other, but they work together. However, the blind spot of these comes about. The blind spot is relationships were ignored. Interdependence with people, things, that skill, and even the language around it disappeared. We start to sense that things that are not material, love, relationships aren't real. We don't have a sense of realness to them because they're not material. And so they're ignored. And therefore, things that are divine, things that we can experience in, say, altered states meditation, which contradict the materialist worldview, were shoved aside and feared because it contradicted the underlying accepted worldview that only matter was real. So what this left us with was a prominent idea called inhumanism. Inhumanism says that humans are limited only by our ability to describe what we want and make it happen. So think of the early 1900s, science is new, and we have these philosophies, these worldviews happening, and like we're going to go full tilt into the future. We can do anything that we can think of, we should do. And the problem with that, the blind spot is that it has no boundary to the reality of our interdependence with each other in the actual physical world. We did not see damage, effect of what we were building on the world around us. We didn't have the sensitivity or the skill of interdependence with the processes of what we call nature and the process of humans in their development. We just put our imagination and the needs of the technology, machines, first. And we still do that. So we can think then that the American dream came out of this side. So when we think of the American dream, it's a really prized institution where we work hard, we go to school, we get an education, we produce things. Either we can become an entrepreneur, we can be a self-made man, particularly, and then you get a house and some land, and you live happily ever after. That map is entirely materialistic. It has no human development in it. It is just domination of the physical landscape. And so even if you succeed in that, which is great, I mean, it's very comfortable, it's wonderful, you yourself don't have the story, you don't have the American dream of, I'm going to progress as a human to be the best human I can be. So it creates a land which has lots of material growth, but not so much inner growth. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Even our universities, well, this is really important because our universities, there were systems of monasteries and universities where that personal human growth was central. The original university was a Buddhist university. And then then they grew into Islam. Islam had universities. And it was yes, there was science, there was knowledge building, but the central idea was that in doing so, you would develop the human being. You become universal. Think of that as holiness. But as we go into the materialist West with its modernist worldview, universities became more about, and education was then framed around service to an economy based on the production of machines. We were machine adapted. And so when we think about the education we have, they are services that all do this. We are meant to literally the education system, the Western education system is built around creating better factory workers. And so it has nothing to do with really the science and understanding of human development. It is, and there's some legitimacy to wanting to be able to work in an economy. When the economy is built on these underlying worldview, the whole thing is a problem. So this set of circumstances that we just described, the modernism of the early 1900s, was immediately challenged by the effect of the world wars. The world wars came out of this highly individualism, high disregard for connection. And what do you expect? The people are going to fight. And so that was a major critique. I mean, very shortly, people would they would question, why are we killing each other? Like, how did, not once, but twice. And then science produced this bomb that can decimate a whole city all at once. Like, how did we get there? How do we get to the point where we can just absolutely, with industrial tools, destroy ourselves? That's a fair analysis, especially in Germany, because Germany was at the center of these wars, and they were, by any standard, the most educated country in the world. Like, they were highly educated, and they had lots of great thinkers there. And so they put their brilliant minds to work on this problem. And at the Frankfurt School, which was this collection of thinkers, they started something called the critical theory. That is, they were like, okay, well, we need to critique what went wrong, and maybe it's not just people. Maybe we need to critique the systems that put this in place. So yes, we're going to say there's problems with people, and we're going to critique that, but we're also going to look at the systems and say that systems create the problems. And so we're going to critique those and then deal with them. However, which is a good idea, by the way. It's true. We should do that. However, the original thinkers of this got the philosophy originally from Marx, which had very good ideas, like we talked about before, but they kept an underlying premise of oppressor and oppressed, that we need to be better at looking at people and systems of oppression and do everything we can to overcome the oppressor. Again, it holds the same problem, that when you live in that worldview, you don't fix the problem, you simply shift who's on top and who's on bottom. Like, you just shift it. It's a system that just destroys itself. So although the idea is good, the underlying worldview caused it to not be very good or continue to have problems. Now, that was after the World Wars. But after the World Wars, there were two things that happened that also changed things. One, we got effective, available at industrial level birth control for women. This was an amazing thing. For the first time in history, we had widespread available birth control. And so women's lives could be less dominated by pregnancy, by childbearing, and then we have more choice in we can have more reproductive choice. And that is a freedom. It also means that we are reshaping mating. And also those hormones also shaped mating patterns. We're going to come back to this, but there was a slight alter. It wasn't a huge altering, but we can see that the population increase started to get some pushback in that time period. And it had to do with changing mating patterns and reproduction patterns. The other thing that happened was industrialization progressed to the point where people could have sedentary lifestyles, because we were no longer driven to use muscle to produce things, to even go places. Like, I can get my car and just go for miles and miles and do almost no labor. It's crazy. It's a miracle. But it meant that human beings, our relationship to our physical world had changed so much that we started building places to just exercise. So I go to a gym and exercise regularly because I have to by choice. So here's a similarity. The birth control gave choice to reproduction. It requires choice to have children. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution, we had to choose to be active physically. And so we're changing our relationship to nature, to natural processes. So where what was once demanded of us out of just biology and physics of life, we started to have to make choices to do those things actively, and not everyone does that. So our relationship to each other and society started to change. Okay. From the 1970s, mostly till today, there was a change in worldview from modernism, given this critical theory and critique, into something we call postmodernism. And so what that critique did of the world wars created a rational response to, okay, what caused us to almost self-destruct? And so let's go through, there's 4 pillars there. First, that we need to apply critical theory. That is the moral necessity of the oppressed to gain power to overcome the oppressor. We talked about why that's a little problematic. It also makes the worldview in which every interaction is about power. That's simply not true either. But that's the underlying worldview there. Oppressed or oppressed, and power gaining or losing power as a means of how to see the world. But it's rational given the political circumstances. Second is, well, if in those world wars we had, and we now have much more technology to be able to see different paces and different stories, that the guns on both sides and ships on both sides of those wars were all Christian, then we need to critique the narrative, the stories that people lived in. And so there's a rejection of all-encompassing grand narrative stories. And we kind of strip them out, and there's a falseness to them, because look, we now know we don't have to live in our regional little areas, and we can realize that the stories we lived in are not the whole story. So the response was just a rejection of those stories that we lived in. So whether it's Christian story, it started with a Christian story, Christian grand narrative that was there, but then it spreads to other countries where people reject their stories. And actually, even in China, they kind of predid this with the Cultural Revolution of this rejecting the story of ancient China, but that's a separate story. So we reject the stories and have a real distrust of anyone that is claiming to build story together. The problem with that is, at least for my generation, is that what that causes is a lack of coherent society. Because in order for us to work together really well, we have to have some shared story, some sort of shared framework. And if that story structure is weakened, we have less in common. Our flow of information, of community, decreases. And so my generation didn't join anything, because what if we bought into a story, this idea that was actually false? And so that was the thing that happened. But with that comes a freedom to deconstruct. The postmodern, the benefit, the beauty of the postmodern worldview is it allows us to deconstruct the things that we believe in the world we live in, and to critique them and to be able to acknowledge the harm that a story can do. We sometimes, in that critique, sometimes leave out the good that it does. So it's sometimes uneven, and actually a lot of times uneven. The last two things, that pillars of the postmodern worldview, is at its extreme form a loss of truth. That is, there's this idea that from the modern worldview, that the only truth that we have is our own, and that everything that we know is relative to where we are. So there is no truth. It depends on just your relative, the things that you believe in, and there's no connection necessarily. It's not even this, it's that you can't really say anything of value. You can't stand on firm ground and say, this is values, this is what I value, but also this may be a value that's good for everybody or most everybody, even in principle. And so you can't say anything positive. And so what happens there is that humans are value machines. Our brain, our whole world is built on values. We make choices about who we're going to talk to and how we're going to talk to them and things like that. And so what happens is in the postmodern worldview, there are values, but a lot of the values go into the unconscious. And yeah. And in that unconscious world, what we see as an effect is prolonged adolescence. Because part of the maturation process is a questioning of the values and ideas we had when we were young, and we should get more articulate as we get older, and we should be able to question them more, and that questioning is a process of maturation. And so if you're told don't necessarily just question and don't really explore other people's worldviews or explore other value systems to critique your own, you get prolonged adolescence. But again, questioning those value systems is a good thing because sometimes there's places that are wrong. And there are pieces of maybe value systems that are hurting people and causing yourself not to grow. So that is a double-edged sword. It has good and bad. And the last part of this is postmodern worldview is the value of diversity. We call diversity as a strength. Fantastic. However, in the postmodern worldview, so when you get rid of, when you live in an oppressed worldview, and you get rid of narratives, of shared, at least conscious shared narratives, and you deconstruct truth, the only values that are left, which is partially true, is the value of diversity. That there is a value to having diversity, but what it comes down to is that the number of ways you are valued by the number of ways you are oppressed, an oppressor class. And so the people that are considered not the oppressors get demonized, and you look at systems and values, and the people that are the most oppressed, the most fringe people become valued, not because they're good for society, not because they've grown as people, not because they are have done in a work or really progressed as humans, but because their status as an oppressed group. And we can see that in how people work. It's not the conscious people don't say that, but we can see that in how people are valued. Now, diversity, what's getting at the core of that is when people can be wise, intelligent, when they've gone from one culture to another, or seeing things from a different perspective. They have perspectival skills. And so at the core of that is not really diversity as it's a kind of a marker, but if someone can see from another person's perspective pretty accurately and be able to see outside themselves, that is a marker of increased wisdom, or the potential of increased wisdom. So it's pointing at something really good, but sometimes the application is not so good or not so useful. So in this postmodern worldview, where everything it's a skills of deconstruction, it's really valuable. It's been really helpful to be able to critique and be able to see, the limitations of all these different ideas. And yes, they've had some problems, but in all, it was a necessary process. You have to deconstruct. In that worldview that I've lived in my whole life, we get to an early information age. This is computers, internet, and let me quickly go through what those look like. The internet and into computers did something society. One, it brought the world closer together. So while we're questioning and deconstructing, we're also getting the possibility of all of the world's information all at once. It's amazing. It's like these things were like, I don't know, meant to be together. Deconstruction, all is information. So for even for my generation, I mean, I could play video games with people across the world, any English speaking, or I could, go online, use a translator, and play games with people in Cambodia or South Korea or Japan. I play with people in Australia, and so as people growing up in a society where you have access in various ways to entertain and interact with people around the world, your world becomes smaller. Like you can, in news sources, you can know about things all over the world in a way that you could never before, and very quickly. And so we become a more global citizen. Even as we have our own different cultures, there is a need to really live and construct a story that holds the whole world together, because that's the world we live in. On the flip side, as there's a greater population, we're continuing to have global population explosion turning at the moment. We'll get to that. We increase isolation. This is the paradox. We now have access to communication, technology, travel, to more places than we ever before as humans. At the same time, everywhere that information technology, the information age is adapted, you get greater and greater isolation, called atomization of people. People feel more lonely, more disconnected. Again, we can talk about reasons why. We can analyze that, but we just need to look at the fact that in places that have greater information technology adoption, we find greater and greater loneliness and isolation. And as part of that, we see less and less relationships, romantic relationships, less children. The birth rate correlates to greater internet and information technology adoption, lower the birth rate. And that holds nearly everywhere. And there's a hint here. It looks like the story that we've lived in, is inadequate to meet our needs. The one place where there has high technology and decent birth rate is Israel. It looks like because Israel is a country with a particular kind of strong story about it. And there's a nationalism and a collective consciousness that's strong. So we can say, we're not going to take a look at the story, but to say that the stories are the reduction in attachment to a story and living in a story, along with all the information technology, causes social cohesion to decrease and population goes down, or the birth rate goes down. And so we're seeing a balance from the population explosion, industrial revolution, and a information age effect of decreased population. So where this ends, we're not sure. We don't know what the future holds, but that seems to be what's going on. The other thing that the information age is doing is causing us to have more and more time in passive awareness. So think about industrial revolution and sedentary lifestyles where we no longer need to use our muscles. Information systems are causing more and more people to not have to use their brain as hard. We spend more time, say, on television, right? On any information that is getting our attention, where we don't have to put our effort into putting our attention there, is passive attention. So spending time scrolling is a perfect example. It is destroying your attention ability. But so where we need to use attention, where a place where we need to use our attention, say driving a little bit, we have to actively perceive what's out there. Prayer is active attention. Meditation, mindfulness is also active attention. There's so much of the world, so much of work is just mindless, low skill, it's repetitive, and so it requires less and less of our attention. And so our attention, we live in a passive attention epidemic. Okay. That seems kind of bleak. We just have deconstruction. Information has benefit, but also has all these downsides. Where are we today? Today, we're moving into something that's currently called meta-modernism. This is that after all this deconstruction, after all of we've had nearly 50 years of just looking and deconstructing every kind of thing, looking critically at everything, that now we are at a point where we need to, there's more and more people doing this, is conscious reconstruction. Now, this is different than it was before. We're not talking about some enlightened being, which wouldn't be bad, but kind of giving us a story. We don't have Moses coming and giving us a story. There's no Muhammad coming and giving us a story. There is a need to individually and then collectively rebuild consciously our underlying worldview. To take all of the good and all of the critique that we've had and say, what can we do to wisely produce a worldview that we can kind of build a future of humanity on? Thich Nhat Hanh said, the way out is in. That's kind of the theme of metamodernism. The way we get out of this lack of meaning, lack of social cohesion, lack of relationships is by going in and doing the work and building things from the inside out. So I'm going to give 4 ways that we do this. This is the what to do about it part. We now kind of have an idea of why the world is the way it is. Technology, critiques. But how do we consciously create a worldview that is better for humans to live in? It's not enough to reject everything. So let's start here. 1, we need to rebuild community. This is really important. We can't get anywhere if we're not connecting to people. We are social animals. And so we need to talk to one another. So there is an opportunity here. Because everyone's so atomized, because everyone is so isolated, there is a dramatic opportunity to build, and I will borrow this term called cherished belonging. That is community, not based on anything, but community first based on, I see you, and I've learned to accept you and see your spark of humanity. We'll call it divinity. And by cherishing you as a person first, without doctrine, without story, that's where we start. We start with, I am curious about you. I have love and curiosity for you. And that is where we start. Without that, nothing else matters. Nothing else will grow. From that, we can say, well, how do we get those skills? How do I get that ability to connect with people? We then acknowledge that we live in an epidemic of passive awareness. And that's going to take me being actively engaged in another person, active awareness. And so the communities can build processes around mindfulness, meditation, like going to a gym. You come to a place where you are gaining the skills, the emotional sovereignty, the ability to communication skills, and the way of being, so that you gain the ability to connect more lovingly and more solidly with other people. It is about real participation in the real world. One of the things that happens that's in that process, if you gain those skills of active awareness, it is not inevitable, but it is highly likely that you will have experiences that challenge a materialism worldview. That there is reality that is not solid. And actually, quantum physics now is getting at this. In fact, our science, our development of science has stalled out in materialism. We haven't made any major, we've had lots of engineering advances, but there's been virtually no scientific basic growth for like 30 years, so a long time. We're stuck in materialism. What we do when we go into these states, we learn to actively see with active attention the world around us. We move from materialism to not mind-body dualism, we'll call this wholeness, where there's a reality that is both material and non-material. They are both real. They both have a physics, meaning a law, a way of functioning that we can observe and follow and use. If you're wondering what that looks like, there are things that we can say are true and there are false. I'm standing on the floor, that's true. It's false to them fall in the air. The fact that those two pieces of information have characteristics is part of the physics. Love, this is an important one. Love cannot be reduced to chemical signals in our body. Love is a real force in the world, and it has properties that interact with the physical world, and is a connection between people. Love is a real thing. It's non-physical. Our body gives us a sense of it, like sight and sound, but it's a real part of the world. And we kind of all know this because we experience it ourselves. We just haven't been given the cultural understanding, cultural worldview that allows us to express it that way. Okay. Build a community, build mindfulness and skills that allow us to enhance that. Number 3, human development, human progression as people. We have known this for a while. Our society, the Western industrial and our information society, is based on us related to machines. We need to continue because we need machines to work and love. I love my car and lights and such. I need those. But what's more important is we now can look at across humanity, this is what human development looks like. This is how we grow from young to middle to grow as people. We know what this looks like. We've studied this for 100 years. Sages have been teaching it for 1,000 years. Every religion is at its core about you becoming the most human you can be. And we can follow that, and we can honor it, and we can reorder our value systems according to becoming better humans. Functionally, intellectually, mentally, what we call spiritually. We can learn the science, but not of just the physical world, but of the science that is the non-physical world. We can understand love and how to relate to one another. We become, in that society, in that group, we value those that have progressed. There's a whole, I can spend a whole lot of time on this, but let me just summarize what this might look like. When we're young, we are simple. We need simple worlds. We need a mother, father, a simple family unit, community live in. As we grow and at the stages, as you grow, you will look at people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi and many others who got to that higher advanced, and they saw everyone as valuable. They made people mad because they wouldn't not love the Hindu and the Muslim at the same time. They wouldn't not love the European American and the African American. They loved them both. And as Martin Luther King Jr. says, we want to be judged according to our character, not our skin color. That is a move toward what I'm talking about. And lastly, as we do this work of building these communities, as we get engaged in human development, we really need a new story to live in. The stories of the axial age, the regional stories of religion are beautiful, wonderful, and they are so helpful, and I love them. I say them myself all the time, but they do not necessarily fit an information age. And so I give a talk like this, Why the World is the Way It Is, to kind of give us a story that engages us, that gives us, here are the important things we should notice. Let's look at relationship and on the worldwide worldview, which we want to create, and the technology, and maybe how to wisely adapt it and use it. Artificial intelligence is here. I use a lot every day. That's going to be, in my opinion, right now, artificial intelligence is the new factory. It is a mid-information age advancement that is going to probably reorder society nearly, if not more, on the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution. And I have no idea where it's going. I'd say none, but not much. I'm guessing. I'm hoping to help shape that. So understanding history this way. So this is a kind of story we can live in. This is why the world is the way it is, that we can then participate in building. It's empowering, it's engaging. It's a story that doesn't say this is the all-encompassing way it is, but it is something that gives us space to make sense of the world, at least enough to function in it, and then to be part of the building process. So I invite you to be a part of that building process. The second one is we need a story about where we fit in the universe, at least as humans. And so during the solstices, my part of that, and there are others doing this similar kind of work, my part of that is to tell a story called The First Woman Story, which tells the origins in a story, a modern myth making, that tells the story of how humans became conscious, how we moved from animal to human. And at the center of that is our spirituality, our connection to the infinite, to God. And so it puts us, humanity, what it means to be human, in cultural, historical settings, includes all of the science, all the paleontology, all of the recorded history. It's not totalizing, but it gives it a framework that we can live in. And so when I go and I can study other religions, other cultures, I have a framework in which to put it in. And it's not divided. I don't have to be, it's not competitive. It is, there's this overarching idea, the story I live in, so that I can see where everything fits. And that is an oral story. It's oral because we don't want to record it. because oral traditions are living, and we need a living, breathing human story. And that story is going to change. It is going to be relative to cultures, right? It's going to change a little bit, but it is enough where we can engage in an oral tradition that's alive and is participatory. Okay. So I invite you to hear that story, to see if it fits for you. It's something that, like this, might need to take a few times over to learn. I know for me and those around me in my close circle, it has been a transformative experience to have a better story, more inclusive story, one that is not just materialist, but also spiritual. So this change into meta-modernism begins with us, begins with our change, with our creating community, with creating the skills to love one another, learning to recognize and value human progression, and then in our own way, looking, creating stories that we can live in peaceably together. And as someone that I really respect says, thank you for your time and your attention. Those are the most valuable things we have. Yeah.